Ever get that, like, deep down gut feeling about something being right or wrong? You know, that unshakable sense that some things just are moral or immoral.
Absolutely. It's a powerful feeling, that's for sure.
Well, today we're going deep into ethical intuitionism, a school of thought that puts those fundamental moral instincts front and center.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of moral philosophy. And
Yeah.
given our audience, I think they're really going to enjoy getting into the weeds with this one. You with me?
Let's do it. For this deep dive, we're going to be drawing primarily from the Stanford Encyclopedia, a philosophy's entry on intuitionism and ethics.
Solid source. A real deep dive for the philosophically inclined.
Exactly. Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to grapple with those big questions. How do we know what's morally right or wrong? And what are those moral properties, like goodness and rightness, actually like in themselves?
Yeah, those are the core puzzles, right? We'll unpack those, explore some of the key debates, and hopefully give our listeners a solid understanding of what ethical intuitionism is all about.
Sounds like a plan. So let's start with a bit of historical context. When did ethical intuitionism as a school of thought really emerge?
Well, it gained a lot of steam in British moral philosophy, starting way back in the early 18th century. It actually held a pretty dominant position until about the 1930s. Then it saw a bit of a decline in the 40s, but here's the interesting thing. It had a bit of a resurgence towards the end of the 20th century.
Oh, really? So it's not just an artifact of history then?
Not at all. It's actually a pretty active area of discussion in moral philosophy. You've got contemporary philosophers like Robert Audi, Jonathan Dancy, Michael Huemer. They're all engaging with and developing intuitionist ideas.
That's wild. Okay, so what are the really core distinctive features of ethical intuitionism? What sets it apart from other ethical theories?
Two things, really. First, there's their epistemology, how they think we come to know moral truths. And then there's their ontology, what they believe those moral properties are.
Okay, I'm following so far. Let's break that down a bit. First up, the epistemology. How do intuitionists believe we come to know what's right and wrong?
The core claim is that certain basic moral propositions are self-evident. They can be known directly, immediately, without needing to rely on arguments or proofs.
So like a direct apprehension of the truth.
Right, an intellectual grasp, if you will.
Gotcha. So it's not like you arrive at those moral truths through a chain of reasoning or anything like that. It's more immediate.
Exactly. A good historical example here is Richard Price. He was a key figure in early intuitionism. He differentiated between this kind of knowledge and other types of knowledge, like our immediate awareness of our own mental states. That's one type.
Right, I can see how that would feel different.
And then there's knowledge derived through argumentation, deduction, where you build up to a conclusion step by step. Intuition, for Price, was a separate thing altogether. It was about direct apprehension by the understanding.
So you just see it, in a sense.
Yeah, see might be a good way to put it. Nowadays, intuitionists often talk about this as intellectual seemings or presentations. So it's like the way a wall just seems green to you visually, it presents itself to your mind in that way. With these intellectual seemings, certain propositions just seem true. They present themselves to our minds as being correct.
I'm getting that. But isn't there a danger there? Couldn't something seem true to us intellectually but actually be false? I mean, think about, like, logical fallacy. They can sound really convincing at first.
That's a super important point, and it actually highlights how intuitionist thought has evolved over time. Most modern proponents acknowledge that these intellectual seemings, as powerful as they are not infallible. Just because something seems true intellectually doesn't automatically mean it is true. That's a key difference from some of the earlier thinkers, like Price, who might have seen intuition as more like a flawless perception of reality.
Oh, so they're not claiming these intuitions are, like, perfect or anything?
No. The contemporary view leaves room for error, which, when you think about it, is pretty realistic, right?
Definitely. I can get behind that. But okay, so if these intuitions aren't infallible, how can they really be a solid foundation for our knowledge of morality? I mean, if they can be wrong.
Well, this is where someone like W.D. Ross comes in. He was a big name in ethical intuitionism, and he had this famous line. He said, "The moral convictions of thoughtful, well-educated people are the data of ethics."
Interesting.
It's kind of like how sensory experiences are the data for science, right? We base our understanding of the natural world on what we observe. And for Ross, these deeply held moral convictions, those that aren't built on other arguments, but that seem fundamental, those are the starting point for ethics.
I see. So there are a couple of ways of thinking about intuition here. On the one hand, it's that immediate intellectual seeming that we were talking about, but it's also about those deeply held, non-inferential moral convictions that people have.
That's a great way to sum it up.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole concept of self-evidence, which seems really central to this whole thing, right?
Absolutely. Self-evidence is key. But we have to be careful here because it's easy to get tripped up. It's crucial to separate the mental event of having an intuition from the actual property of a proposition being self-evident.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, an intuition is something that happens in your mind. It's a mental state. Self-evidence, on the other hand, is a characteristic of the proposition itself. It's like a proposition is either self-evident or it isn't, regardless of whether someone actually has an intuition about it. Makes sense.
Yeah. So one's in the head and one's about the truth itself, the idea itself.
Exactly. And a self-evident proposition, this is the classic idea, is one that warrants belief simply by understanding what it means. It's like it justifies itself.
It's just there.
In a way, yeah. Price, that guy we talked about earlier, he said these self-evident truths are incapable of proof. But, like we said, later thinkers like Ross had a more nuanced view. They argued that these truths might not strictly need proof, but you could potentially still infer them from other things. And the key idea is that you might be able to, build an argument for a self-evident proposition, but your ultimate justification for believing it isn't based on that argument. The understanding of the proposition itself is what does the justifying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So it's not about, needing a bunch of evidence or reasoning to get to the truth. It's more like the truth is just right there in the meaning itself.
Precisely.
Okay. But hold on a sec. If we're thinking of intuitions as these intellectual seemings, how can they really justify belief? It almost feels like you're saying a hunch can prove something.
I see where you're coming from. It's definitely a bit tricky. And yeah, if you take intuition to simply mean an intellectual seeming, then trying to justify that seeming with more reasoning seems, kind of circular, right?
Totally.
But here's how contemporary intuitionists tackle this. They say the seeming itself, that immediate intellectual grasp, is what gives you the initial support for the belief. It's kind of like how a perceptual seeming, the way something looks, can justify your belief about, how that thing is.
Okay, that makes sense. Like if I see a red apple, that visual seeming is what makes me believe the apple is red.
Exactly. Of course, that justification can be overridden. Like maybe you find out later that the lighting was messed up or you were wearing weird glasses or something.
Right.
But the seeming itself gives you a starting point, a reason to believe. So it's the same with these intellectual seemings. They give you a prima facie justification for believing in self-evident moral truths.
I'm following. So when we talk about self-evidence, we're not just saying that something is obvious to everyone.
Right. That's a super important distinction, especially for us philosophy folks. Obviousness is, it's subjective. It depends on the person, their experiences, their culture. What's obvious to me might not be obvious to you,
Right.
Self-evidence, the way intuitionists use it, isn't like that. It's not relative. A proposition is either self-evident or it's not, period. It doesn't matter if everyone recognizes it or not.
Got it. Could you give me an example to illustrate that? The difference between obviousness and self-evidence, I mean.
Sure. Think about the statement, the sun will rise tomorrow. That's pretty obvious to most people, right? Based on our experience, we just expect it to happen. But it's not actually self-evident in the philosophical sense. It's an inference based on what we've observed in the past.
Like we're assuming the future will be like the past.
Exactly. But there's no guarantee, right?
Right.
Now, contrast that with a principle like if something is red, then it is colored. That might not be immediately obvious to everyone, but once you understand what red means and what colored means, the truth of the statement is right there in those meanings.
Ah, I see. So it's about understanding the concepts themselves being enough to get you to the truth of the proposition.
That's the standard view, yeah. Thinkers like Locke, Price, Ross, Audi, they all point to this idea. If you grasp the meaning of the terms in a self-evident proposition, you'll see that it has to be true.
The understanding does the work.
Precisely.
Okay, but now I'm thinking, and this is where my philosopher brain kicks in, how do we know when a proposition really is self-evident? How do we know it's not just something we happen to believe strongly or something we've been taught to accept?
That's where it gets really interesting. One philosopher who tried to grapple with that is Henry Sidgwick. He came up with some criteria to help us figure out which propositions are likely to be genuinely self-evident.
Like tests for self-evidence.
Yeah, kind of. He said these propositions should be clear, distinct, something you arrive at through careful reflection. They should also be consistent with other self-evident truths. And ideally, they should be things that most thoughtful people would agree on.
So, a kind of consensus among the wise.
Something like that. Although even Sidgwick admitted that his own ethical principles, the ones he thought were foundational, didn't perfectly fit all of his own criteria.
That's honest.
It's tough, right? And there's another layer to this, too. You can know that something's true, that a self-evident proposition is true, without necessarily having that higher-level understanding that it is self-evident. Does that make sense?
I think so. It's like you could have a gut feeling that something is wrong, morally wrong, without having all the philosophical jargon about self-evidence.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
So, yeah, self-evidence is a tricky concept to pin down.
It definitely is. But speaking of tricky, one of the biggest challenges to ethical intuitionism, the one that everyone brings up, is the problem of moral disagreement. If these fundamental moral truths are supposed to be self-evident, how come people disagree about morality so much? I mean, across cultures, within cultures, we just don't seem to agree on what's right and wrong a lot of the time.
Right. That's a huge hurdle for any ethical theory, really. And intuitionists have had to come up with some pretty clever responses. One of their main points is that a lot of what looks like moral disagreement actually boils down to disagreements about non-moral facts.
Oh, interesting.
So, like, take the example of eating lobsters. Some people think it's morally wrong, others don't. But maybe they actually agree on the underlying moral principle, like, say, minimizing suffering. The disagreement is about whether lobsters actually suffer, which is a factual question, not a moral one.
So the basic moral intuition is the same, don't cause suffering, but people have different beliefs about the facts of the matter.
Exactly. And another big point is that disagreements often arise not about the basic principles themselves, but about how to apply them or which ones are more important in a given situation.
Okay, I could see that. Like, most people would agree that honesty is important and that helping others is important. But what if you're in a situation where you have to lie to protect someone?
That's the classic dilemma, right? And that brings us to W.D. Ross again and his idea of prima facie duties.
Right. Refresh my memory on that one.
So Ross argued that we have these self-evident duties, things like keeping promises, not harming others, showing gratitude, stuff like that. But these are prima facie duties, meaning they hold at first glance. But in a specific situation, you might have conflicting duties, and you have to figure out which one takes priority. That's where things get messy.
It definitely does. But what about disagreement among, like, professional philosophers? You'd think they'd be able to figure this stuff out.
It's true. Philosophical disagreement is a tougher nut to crack. But intuitionists have some responses here, too. They point out that even philosophers can come from different backgrounds with different assumptions, and they might prioritize certain principles over others.
Right, like maybe one philosopher is more focused on individual rights, while another is more concerned with the overall good.
Exactly. And they might just have different levels of clarity in their own moral intuitions on specific issues. Or maybe one philosopher has had a really powerful experience that's shaped their thinking in a certain way.
That makes sense.
Plus, people change their minds. A philosopher might have a really strong initial intuition about something, but then they encounter a strong argument that convinces them otherwise.
That happens to me all the time.
Right. And then some intuitionists also acknowledge that things like moral immaturity, biases, even corruption can cloud our ability to clearly see those self-evident moral truths.
So, just because people disagree, even really smart people, doesn't automatically mean there are no self-evident moral truths.
That's the core idea. And remember, self-evidence doesn't equal obviousness. Something can be self-evident, but not obvious to everyone right away.
Right. Got it. But okay, now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, empirical psychology. Specifically, all those trolley problem studies. Those seem to throw a real wrench into the whole idea that our moral intuitions are reliable. How do intuitionists deal with that?
The trolley problem is such a fun thought experiment, isn't it? All these variations, the switch case, the bridge case, the trapdoor case, they really get people thinking. And the interesting thing is, people's intuitions about what's morally permissible seem to change depending on the specifics of the scenario. Like, most people think it's okay to flip a switch to divert a trolley and save 5 lives, even if it means one person dies. But they're much less comfortable pushing someone off a bridge to achieve the same outcome.
Yeah, it's weird. If we're all tapping into these self-evident moral truths, shouldn't our intuitions be more consistent?
That's the challenge, right? One way people have tried to explain this discrepancy is with something called the doctrine of double effect. This principle says it can be morally okay to cause harm as a side effect of doing something good, but it's wrong to intend that harm as the means to the good.
So in the switch case, the one person dying is just a side effect of saving the 5, but in the bridge case, you're using that person's death to stop the trolley. But then there's that trapdoor case,
Yeah.
right? Where you have to open a trapdoor, which will drop a person onto the tracks, stopping the trolley. That seems like you're using the person's death as a means, just like the bridge case. But people's intuitions tend to line up more with the switch case there.
You got it. And that's the problem with the doctrine of double effect. It doesn't seem to fully explain these differences in our intuitions. So some psychologists have suggested other factors are at play, like the up-close and personal aspect of the bridge case. You're physically pushing someone to their death. That creates a stronger emotional response, even if it's not morally relevant.
Right. It's more visceral, I guess.
Exactly. And this raises a worry. What if our moral intuitions are being influenced by things that have nothing to do with the actual morality of the action? Things like emotional reactions or personal biases.
That's a problem for intuitionism, for sure.
Big time. And then there's the research on framing effects. The way a scenario is described or the order in which you consider different cases can totally change people's judgments. And again, these framing effects are morally irrelevant, but they seem to be affecting our intuitions.
It really makes you wonder how much we can trust those gut feelings, huh?
It does. Now, to be fair to the intuitionists, some of them, like Ross, focused more on prima facie duties rather than absolute rules. He argued that our intuitions about those basic moral principles, like the duty to keep promises or the duty to prevent harm, those might be more reliable. They're more fundamental, less likely to be swayed by these framing effects.
So the intuition that saving a life is good, taking a life is bad, those might be more stable.
That's the idea. Though, even those basic intuitions have been questioned by some research. Some studies suggest that even our most basic moral judgments can be affected by various psychological biases. So it's definitely an ongoing debate.
Okay, so long story short, the reliability of our moral intuitions, especially given all this psychology research, is a big problem for ethical intuitionism.
No doubt about it. There's a philosopher, Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who's argued that empirical psychology shows that a lot of our moral beliefs are actually based on unreliable intuitions. They're easily swayed by all sorts of irrelevant factors.
That's a serious charge.
It is, and this undermines the whole idea of non-inferential justification. That idea that we can be justified in believing something is morally true just because we have a strong intuition about it, without needing any further reasoning or evidence.
Right, that was one of the key things we talked about earlier. So is that it? Has psychology dealt a fatal blow to intuitionism?
Well, not so fast. Some intuitionists have tried to push back using some pretty interesting arguments. For example, there's Ballantyne and Thoreau. They use these concepts of undercutting defeaters and defeaters of defeaters.
Now you're just using fancy words to confuse me.
Huh. Fair enough. It's a bit technical, I admit. But the basic idea is this. Even if some psychological factor can act as a defeater, something that undermines the justification provided by an intuition, you might have independent reasons to believe that that defeater isn't actually at work in a given case.
Okay.
So, they have this example of a guy, McCoy, who's looking at a widget. And he thinks the widget is white. But there's been a suggestion that there's a red light shining on it, which could distort his perception.
So the red light is like the defeater. It could make him think the widget is white, even if it's not.
Exactly. But now imagine McCoy has good reason to believe that there's actually no red light shining on the widget. In that case, his initial perception of the widget as white is still justified, even though there was that potential defeater.
Interesting. So it's like, even if there's a possible reason to doubt your intuition, if you can rule out that reason, then your intuition is back in the game.
That's a great way to put it. But even Ballantyne and Thoreau admit that this doesn't necessarily save all of our moral beliefs. If it turns out that a lot of our intuitions are actually systematically flawed or easily messed up by irrelevant things, well, then we're in trouble.
Fair enough. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the epistemological side of ethical intuitionism, how they think we know right from wrong. But what about the ontological side? What do intuitionists actually believe those moral properties, like goodness and rightness, are?
Right, onto the nature of morality itself. So here, the core idea is usually something called non-naturalist realism.
Non-naturalist realism. Yeah, I love those philosophy terms. Break it down for me.
It's simpler than it sounds, I promise. So realism just means they think moral judgments can be true or false. They're about something real in the world. And non-naturalist means that these moral properties, things like goodness and rightness, can't be boiled down to natural property.
Natural properties.
Oh,
Like what?
like stuff we can study through science. Psychological states, social patterns, biological facts, physical stuff. Intuitionists argue that moral properties belong to a whole different category. You can't fully capture them with these natural descriptions.
So goodness isn't just like pleasure or happiness.
Nope. Those are natural states. You can measure them. But goodness for the intuitionist is something more than that. It's a different kind of thing altogether. Now, some early intuitionists went even further. They said that these moral properties are simple and indefinable, period. You can't define them in terms of anything else, whether it's natural or even other moral concepts.
So like goodness is just goodness, end of story.
Basically. And the way they got there is interesting. They argued that our most basic moral concepts are unanalyzable. You can't break them down into simpler parts. And they assume that this tells us something about the properties themselves. Like, if we can't define the concept, maybe the property is also indefinable. And if you think back to our friend Richard Price, he connected this to the whole empiricist idea that simple ideas have to come from direct experience. You either get them through your senses or through your understanding.
Right.
So Price said that our ideas of right and wrong aren't just feelings that get triggered by things in the world. They have to be perceptions of our understanding. We're recognizing real, objective properties of actions and people.
Fascinating. And then G.E. Moore comes along and really doubles down on the whole non-natural aspect of goodness.
Oh, yeah. Moore is a big deal in this whole discussion. He really went after what he called the naturalistic fallacy, the attempt to define goodness in terms of natural properties. At first, he tried to define natural properties as things that can exist on their own in time, but he moved away from that later on. His more important contribution was an epistemological definition. Natural properties are the things that natural sciences and psychology deal with. So we learn about them empirically through observation and experiment. But our knowledge of goodness, he argued, is different. It has an a priori element. We know it through intuition, not just through our senses.
That makes sense. And that leads us to his famous open question argument, right?
You got it. That's his main weapon against anyone who tries to define goodness naturalistically. He said, imagine you define goodness as, say, pleasure. So goodness equals pleasure, by definition. Now, if that's true, then asking, is something that is pleasurable good, should be a meaningless question.
Because it's like asking, is something that's pleasurable, pleasurable?
Exactly, a closed question. But Moore's point is that the question, is pleasure good, is not meaningless. It's a genuine question that we can ask. It's an open question. And that means, he argued, that goodness can't be the same thing as pleasure, or any other natural property, for that matter.
That's a really interesting argument. It feels pretty intuitive, too. But haven't philosophers who favor a more naturalistic view of morality come up with some counter-arguments?
Of course. Philosophers love to argue, remember?
That's true.
One common objection is that Moore is kind of assuming his conclusion. He's already assuming that any naturalistic definition of goodness is going to leave that goodness question feeling open. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's a naturalistic definition that would make the question feel closed. We just haven't found it yet.
Okay, interesting. Any other objections?
Yeah, some people say the open question argument is just a version of the paradox of analysis. This is the idea that any good analysis of a concept might seem uninformative because it's just saying what we already know implicitly.
It's like explaining a joke. It ruins the fun.
Exactly. And then some naturalists argue that there could be really complex, non-obvious definitions of goodness that are naturalistic. Maybe they wouldn't feel like closed questions at first, but they could still be true.
So goodness could be this complex natural phenomenon that we just haven't fully understood yet.
That's one way to think about it. But here's the thing. Even if we can't perfectly define the concept of goodness using natural terms, does that mean the property of goodness itself can't be natural?
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
There's a difference between the concept and the actual property out there in the world.
Exactly. And that's a distinction that naturalists really push on. They use the example of water. We didn't figure out that water is H2O by just thinking really hard about the concept of water, right? We had to do science, experiment, figure out its chemical composition.
So just because we haven't found a naturalistic definition of goodness yet doesn't mean there isn't one. It could be like water. We need science to uncover the deeper truth.
That's the hope from the naturalist's perspective. Now, to be fair to Moore and Ross, they did seem to get the difference between a verbal definition and a metaphysical definition. They weren't just mixing up concepts and properties willy-nilly.
Okay, good to know.
But they did seem to believe in a pretty tight connection between the two. They thought that there's a kind of mirroring between our concepts and the world.
An isomorphism. But, like we said with water and heat, that's not always the case, right? Our everyday concepts can be pretty different from the underlying reality.
For sure. But intuitionists might push back here. They could say that the concept of goodness just feels different from those other concepts, like water or heat. It doesn't feel incomplete or superficial in the same way.
Okay.
Like one intuitionist, A.C. Ewing, he analyzed goodness in terms of fitting attitudes. Basically, goodness is what it's fitting to approve of or value. And intuitionists would say this kind of analysis gets at something deeper, something more than just subjective feelings or observable stuff.
I'm getting that.
Yeah.
But I can already hear the critics saying even those fitting attitude analyses seem kind of circular or shallow. They don't really explain why some things are good.
Yeah, you're right. And philosopher Robert Shaver has pointed out that some intuitionist analyses, like the ones from Pritchard and Broad, might actually still be compatible with a naturalistic account of those fitting attitudes or moral obligations.
So even those analyses might not be the slam dunk that intuitionists think they are.
Right. And Shaver also reminds us that sometimes you can figure out these synthetic identities a priori just through reasoning. It's not always about empirical science, so the whole debate is more complex than just science versus intuition.
For sure. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we wrap up, we have to address one more big challenge to ethical intuitionism, J.L. Mackie, and his famous queerness objection.
Ah, yes. Mackie. He really threw down the gauntlet with that one.
So what's the deal with queerness? What was Mackie getting at?
Well, he argued that the kind of non-natural moral properties that intuitionists believe in, they're just too weird. Too unlike anything else we know about the world. They just don't fit in.
They're queer.
Exactly. And he points to a few ways in which they're queer. One is their unanalyzability, but we've already talked about that. And as we saw, that's not unique to moral properties. But Mackie's more powerful point is about their alleged motivational force.
What does that mean?
Well, he argued that if these non-natural moral properties existed the way intuitionists say they do, then just recognizing that something is good would automatically make you want to do it.
Okay.
Like imagine you see a delicious cookie, you just know it's delicious. That knowledge in itself makes you want to eat the cookie.
I could definitely relate to that.
Right. But Mackie's point is that no other kind of property we know of works that way. Usually there's a separate step between recognizing something and being motivated to act on it.
That does sound kind of strange when you put it like that.
Right. It's like the moral property itself has this built-in to-be-pursuedness.
Like a magnetic pull towards goodness.
Exactly. And Mackie found that really implausible.
So how do intuitionists respond to that?
Well, one way is to bring back those fitting attitude analyses. Remember, those say that goodness is about having properties that give us reasons to have certain attitudes, like we should approve of good things, admire them, value them. So maybe the motivation to do good things comes from our recognizing these reasons, not from the goodness itself having some magical motivational power.
Because the motivation is grounded in reason, not in some weird property of goodness itself.
That's the idea. But Mackie had another issue with this whole line of thinking. He pointed out that moral reasons are often seen as categorical. They apply to us regardless of what we happen to want or desire.
So they're not just hypothetical imperatives like if you want X, do Y. They're more like do Y, period.
Exactly. And that's a problem from Mackie's perspective, which is rooted in a more Humean view of motivation. Hume thought that all our reasons for acting ultimately come from our desires. So this idea of categorical reasons, reasons that bind us no matter what we want, seemed really strange to Mackie.
It's like, where do those reasons come from, if not from our own desires? It's a mystery.
Right. And then there's another kind of queerness that Mackie pointed out, the epistemic kind. How could we possibly know about these non-natural moral properties? They don't cause anything in the physical world, so how do they even register on our radar?
It's like there's